Today is July 26th,
7th.
27th, 2009. We are going to interview Al Nagy. His birth date is January 28th, 1925. The people here are Nick Nagy, his grandson, Jean Nagy, his daughter, and Stephen Nagy is the cameraman, and he's his son. So, when you were in the war, what branch of the service were you in?
I was in the Army.
And what was your rank, and what did you do for them?
I had 2 jobs in the Army. I started off as a crew member on 81 millimeter mortar crew, and then I went to radio school, and for the rest of the war I was a shortwave radio operator.
So, but can we go back? What's a 21-inch mortar, or whatever you said?
81 millimeter mortar?
Yeah.
Well, at that time it was the big mortar. They have much bigger mortars today. Got 4.2, and I don't know what else they got, but anyway.
It's the diameter of the barrel.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And how long did it take you to become a shortwave radio operator?
I went to radio school on Bougainville, and I think it lasted about a month. And then after that I switched from a line company, went to regimental headquarters as a radio operator.
So did you go in the field with a big radio pack
Well,
and a big antenna sticking up over your head so you
yeah,
were sniper fire?
For a while I had a Jeep with a radio mounted on it, and then I had a command car, Stephen, a command car. And other times we carried the radio, but you needed someone to crank the generator for you, so it was a 2-man operation sometime. One guy to do the sending, another one to crank the generator.
And who did you serve under, or who was using the radio that you were carrying around for them?
Generally, we were in regimental headquarters, and we were assigned to different officers in the regimental headquarters unit. Sometime I rode with the colonel, sometime I rode with some other people.
Where were you drafted, or did you enlist?
Actually, my birthday was in January 28th, and my cousin, who was a month younger than I was, wanted us to join the Navy together. And my mother was very opposed to it because she was afraid for my safety, and my dad had just been killed in an auto accident in 1935, so she didn't want me to go. So finally he got tired of waiting, and he went and joined the Navy, and eventually wound up on a subtender. And I wound up being drafted in April of 1943, and I got the other end of the stick. I went to the infantry. He went to the Navy, I went to the infantry. So that's the way it goes.
So you didn't get to pick where your service or anything?
I was really hoping that I'd go to the Air Force, because as a kid I used to build model airplanes and was kind of interested in airplanes, but it wasn't to be. From Akron I went to Fort Hays in Columbus, Ohio for processing, and from there we took a train right down to Fort Knox in Kentucky. And Fort Knox also had an airfield, and they were flying 2-engine bombers out of there. So I thought, well, one of these days I'm going to go down and apply for a transfer. And I did, and they turned me down because they said I didn't have any skills that the Air Force was in need of, since I only had 3 years of high school as a vocational school. So that was the end of my Air Force career.
Do you recall your first days in service, and what did it feel like?
What did it feel like? I was real thrilled because went to Columbus, and the first night they had a USO show, and the Andrews sisters were there. So I thought, boy, this is great. But that was the end of the good times.
Just one night?
Yeah, from there it was all downhill. And then we were only there a couple of days. They gave us aptitude tests and another physical, I guess, and then we went off to Fort Knox.
And what year was that?
43.
And why did your grandma let you go then when she
She didn't have any choice. I was drafted.
Oh, so they drafted you out of high school.
Well, no, I went to a 3-year vocational high school.
Oh, okay.
Only had to go 3 years. And so I was working in a print shop at the Goodrich Company when I was drafted. And she didn't have any choice then. I got my little notice that says report, so I went. She was real brave though when we went to the train station. But my sister said that after I left she cried for 3 days. She's gonna come and get me.
No. Do you remember boot camp?
Yeah.
How good or bad was that?
It wasn't too bad. I remember I went on KP one time, guard duty, all that nonsense that you go through at boot camp, so it wasn't too bad. We had basic and advanced training there. One of the bad things though was that at Fort Knox they had permanent cadre. And like our lieutenant and the sergeants, they stayed there, you know, and normally it's nice to have these people go with you if you're going to combat, but it wasn't that way. They said, well, goodbye, we'll see you.
So how did you pick up your colonels or whoever was in charge of you?
How did it do what?
How did you pick up your captains and colonels?
They were assigned, they were assigned.
They were waiting for you in
They
the
were
Pacific?
waiting for us there, yeah. Yeah. So we were quartered in World War I barracks, by the way. They were short of barrack space, so they threw us in these World War I barracks.
When did you find out you were going to the Pacific?
Oh, at the end of advanced training, one day they said we're leaving for California. Got on this train and headed west. It was kind of interesting. I recall one day we stopped at a little town in Wyoming. It was early morning. It was ice cold, practically, and we got off the train there to exercise a little bit, and they had all these women there with coffee and donuts, and they were all parents of people who had men and women in the armed forces, and so they were serving coffee and donuts. I thought that was real nice.
How long did it take you to get from Fort Knox to San Francisco?
I don't recall because we went in a Pullman train, so it was more than one day. I guess it was about 3 days.
Do you think you got enough training to go to the South Pacific?
Well, they said we did. I didn't, you know, you never really have enough training until the bullets start flying and you say, well, they never told us about that. But they say, oh, you'll learn once you get over there, you know, no big deal.
Do you remember any of your instructors? I
remember my sergeant, his name was Robert Farnham. And he's the only one that I remember. I don't remember my lieutenant or any of the other sergeants. For whatever reason, his name was stuck with me.
Was he relatively nice, or was he your stereotypical?
Yeah, they were real nice. He was real nice, I thought. During all the time I was in service, which was almost 3 years, I never had a furlough. Never had a furlough. And I went home to Akron on a weekend pass. That was the only time I got to go home. And I didn't stay home very long because by the time I got home I had to turn around and come back. So this is just on a weekend. That was it.
Which wars?
Yeah.
Which war did you serve in?
Which war?
Which war?
World War II.
And where did you end up in World War II?
In the Pacific, on Luzon, Philippine Islands.
Was that your first stop after you left San Francisco?
No, that was the last stop. First stop was New Caledonia.
See, I always thought you went to the Philippines and then New Caledonia.
No, we went from San Francisco to New Caledonia, which is about 13,000 miles away, I guess. And we made it in 13 days, if I remember. And we were only in New Caledonia for about a week. We were waiting for a ship from New Caledonia to go up to Guadalcanal, one of these island freighters. And so we got to Guadalcanal and we found out that we were going to be replacements for the 37th Division, which had just come back from the New Georgia campaign. And they were looking for replacements. And so that's when the first time I found out what we were going to do. First assignment was as a machine gunner, 30 caliber water cooled machine gunner, and I soon recognized there wasn't much of a future being a machine gunner, and so they had all these other vacancies, and finally I bounced around a little bit and wound up at another company with this mortar outfit, a 3-member mortar crew, and we stayed with that on Bougainville.
Can we back up to the trip across the ocean?
Yeah.
What ship did you take to get there?
We went overseas on the Lurline, which before the war was a high-class passenger ship that normally went between San Francisco and Hawaii, 5-day cruise. A lot of rich people, mostly film stars, who went back and forth from Hawaii on a 5-day trip. And then after the war started, the government took the ship over. The ship normally in peacetime carried about maximum 725 people. During wartime, they got up to 4,000. And on one trip, they carried more than 4,200 troops, someplace, I don't know where. But anyway, so it was no longer just a luxury liner, it was just a ship, a big gray ship.
Do you remember being like crammed in as sardines, or was it more freedom than that?
Yeah, you were crammed in. I guess the worst part was salt water. You took a shower with salt water, and then you dry off, and everything was just real sticky. Nice feeling, right, Stephen?
Did anything interesting happen on your trip over?
Well, one day we were in the middle of the ocean, and I was standing at the rail looking down into the water, kind of feeling sorry for myself, and somebody said, "Hey, there's a man overboard." And I looked down into the water, and I didn't see anybody. And the next thing I knew, there were life jackets being tossed down into the water. And everyone was running up to the rails to see who it was and where it was. And the ship, I still didn't see anybody, and the ship made one circle. Didn't slow down at all, just made one circle and kept on going. And the question was there really somebody in the water or not? And my guess was somebody just had too much to drink and to kind of liven up the cruise a little bit, yelled, "Man overboard!" And the question that always comes to mind, if there had been somebody in the water, would they have stopped to pick him up? And my guess is they would not have stopped to pick him up. At the same time, they had enforced radio silence, so they couldn't send a radio message, and we were about 7 days out of New Caledonia, so if there had been somebody in the water, it would have never made it.
So is there alcohol on board this Lorelei?
Alcohol?
To drink?
Well, I guess people
Made their own?
made their own,
Or
carried their own in their canteen cups.
So you said when you finally bounced around in New Caledonia, you ended up with a mortar crew.
When I went to Guadalcanal, yeah.
Was this mortar thing on the back of a Jeep, or did you have to
No,
carry
you
it?
carried it. There was a 3-piece. You had the firing tube, you had a base plate, and you had the tripod. And each of the 3-member crew carried one of the pieces.
And who carried all the mortars? Or how many did you have to carry?
I only carried one of the 3 pieces.
No mortars. the things you
Shells?
put. Yeah, shells. Sorry.
Well, that was one of the problems because these shells were kind of big and heavy. And so normally you couldn't carry more than about 3. And you could shoot 3 off in about 10 seconds.
So between you maybe had 9 of
Yeah,
them.
something like that, yeah.
So how did you get resupplied?
Well,
So you shoot them off, boom, 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 and then what do you do?
Well, normally they had to make arrangements to bring up some additional supplies once you got set up. And so from Guadalcanal, we were there, I don't know how many days. The island had already been secured, but there were still a few Japs running around that had been kind of bypassed. But we never saw any. And most of the time on Guadalcanal, we spent unloading ships, because by that time Guadalcanal was in the backwaters of the Pacific area, and it was being built up as a supply base. And so we were unloading ships there. And in the morning you'd wake up and there'd be a few bodies that would be floating up on the beach. Normally Japanese Navy personnel or American Navy personnel who'd been killed in battles out in, not too far from there, not too far north of Guadalcanal.
In the Pacific?
Yeah.
Did you see any combat
Yeah.
on Guadalcanal?
Our first assignment was going to Bougainville, which is the largest island in the Solomon chain. And the mission there was not to take the whole island. The mission there was just to take enough real estate so that they could build a couple of airfields. And from there they wanted to use those airfields to bomb like Rabaul and Truk and places, other Japanese fortifications up the road there. And so we got up there, and there were a lot of Japs on Bougainville, but they thought we were going to chase them all over the island, so they kind of backed off, and we just took enough real estate, and after they got enough land for what they wanted for their bases, they said, okay, we're going to set up a perimeter here, this is as far as we're going. So then they started building pillboxes and cutting out firing lanes and all kinds of things like that. And several months later, the Japs recognized that we were going after them, and they had already been cut off from the Japanese supply base, so they were getting kind of desperate, and so they launched an attack against the American lines. And it was no big secret that they were coming. They'd been sending out patrols every day, and they had airplanes that were flying over, and they saw them coming, and so it was no big deal. We'd been assigned targets, and all these targets had been zeroed in advance using what do you use to zero in? You use smoke shells, because you could see where they landed.
What do you mean zero in? You set up the distance for the mortars, how far you have to set?
They said that when they attack, this is going to be your assigned area. You got it here, here, and here, and these are all numbered. And before they came, we had fired into these areas to determine what the distance was, and so forth and so on, using smoke shells. And so when the Japs started attacking, they would call up and say, fire into this zone here. And we'd fire in there, or they'd change it, fire to some other zone. And finally they decided to launch an attack against the American line, and to their credit, they broke through. They broke through in one of our companies, and they only were there, they got through for a day, and then they brought up some reserves and sent them back, plugged the hole up. But anyway, one of the surprising things was that I remember on one time we were asked to fire on our own positions, and somebody on the radio was saying, why do you want to fire on your own position? He said, well, there's Japs right outside here, keep firing. And so we fired on American positions there. They were kind of concerned that maybe the Japs were going to take the whole island back, and so they already had these airfields that were operating, and they had alerted the Air Force and said, just get ready. If they do break through, we're gonna have to move all the airplanes off to some other island. But they didn't get through, they didn't break through.
So how long did that fight last?
About 1 day, 2 days,
And what happened to the Japanese? Did you win?
we won.
And then they went back to their side of the
They
island?
went back to the other side of the island there. You just never saw so many dead Japs laying around out there. It was just terrible. And when they found out that the Japs were coming, the general sent out a call for additional artillery pieces throughout the South Pacific area. And so in addition to our own artillery units, they brought in about 15, 20 other artillery pieces for extra firepower. So we were ready for the Japs.
So who had the fun job of going out and picking up all these bodies? Or did you just leave them?
The engineers.
The engineers or the
They
people
came
that
out
pick
with
up?
something called a bulldozer and dug a hole and pushed them in there. You just about had to do that, you know, the jungle was steaming hot, and then after you'd been laying out in the sun for a day, it was a terrible smell. So I had to get rid of them.
Did you ever feel your life was personally in danger?
My
Your life?
I don't know, I thought maybe on Luzon I might have been, but I'm not sure. So that's another story. You want to save that for later? Or?
Sure, we'll
Okay.
save it. So how long were you on Guadalcanal and Bougainville?
We were on Bougainville for about a year, and that was the first time of my life because it rained almost every day on Bougainville. It started about 3 o'clock, and so you were always wet. You had a poncho, but your feet were always wet, and you slept in a wet foxhole. You could only dig down so far, and the water would start seeping in. So it was a terrible life, and I think it was the only time in my Army career that I felt I didn't give a damn whether I got killed or not. And it's a bad feeling to have because it's almost like a death wish. And in combat, if you wish that you were dead, it won't take long before it's going to come true. So anyway, one of the worst things that happened to us on Bougainville, the first day we were there, we dug in for the night, and one of the guys who had trained with us at Fort Knox and some others were in a foxhole, and they thought they heard some Japs in front of the hole there, so one guy pulls out a hand grenade. He throws it out there, and it hits a tree limb, bounces back into the hole, and they're all killed first day in combat. So it's just a terrible feeling. Kind of wonder what they told their parents, you know, that it was one of those stupid things that just happened in combat.
So when you were all wet and you couldn't dry your feet and socks out, did you ever get foot rot or any other? How'd you keep your feet dry? I mean, if you...
Well, you had extra pairs of socks and you tried to keep dry, and it was just like living in filth. And about a month after we were on Bougainville, I developed a great big boil on my face, and finally I decided I better go see the medics. So I went to sick call. It was the first and only time I ever went on sick call, and they looked at it, cleaned it up. They wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't squeeze it. And the way they took the pus out of it, the guy got a big piece of gauze and pushed it up against my face and squeezed it that way. And then they bandaged it up and left, and eventually it disappeared and left a great big scar up there.
That's your war wound?
That's my war wound, yeah.
Did they give you any antibiotics or anything?
No,
No?
no,
Just go back to the dirt?
yeah. So when we left, I was already a radio operator then. When we left Bougainville, I was in regimental headquarters, and then so the next stop was going to be Luzon.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How'd you go from being a mortar man to a radio man
I went to this radio school on the island.
on Bougainville?
Yeah, it was put on by the division.
Why'd you decide to change?
Well, I thought it'd be exciting, a heck of a lot more exciting than being a member of a mortar crew. And so,
Less weight?
huh?
Less weight?
Yeah, and so I thought, heck, why not? So they gave you a test to see whether you had
Nimble fingers?
aptitude for being a radio operator. And I guess I passed, and then I went to this radio school. There are about 15 or 20 of us in this school.
Did you have to learn Morse code, or was it all?
Morse code, yeah. Yeah.
So you became a radio operator, and then where did they send you after Bougainville?
We went to Luzon. We were on the way to Luzon. And on the way to Luzon, we stopped for a practice landing in New Guinea, Laos, New Guinea. Barb was there, by the way, on her round-the-world trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a practice landing there, and by the time we got up there, we'd been laying around on the ship for 7 or 10 days, and we were kind of rusty. And the deal was you're supposed to hit the beach and get off of the beach. You don't stay on the beach at all. And so I was assigned to an Air Force guy who was going to be with us for a while to see whether we really need to call in the Air Force for any Jap targets on Luzon. So he and I were teamed together. And so we were getting ready to hit the beach, and the ramp goes down on this LCI, the Landing Craft Infantry, and I rush off and hit the sand. It's about a foot deep, and I fall on my face. And here's this Air Force officer standing behind me. He said, "Okay, Nagy, get off your feet, get off your feet. We got to get off the beach. We got to get off the beach." I says, "I can't get up. It's radio too heavy." He said, "Oh, okay." So he lifted the radio off of my back, and I got up and we charged off of the beach.
Do you remember his name?
No. Anyway, they had some umpires there, people who did the evaluation to see whether it was effective or not, and they gave us a satisfactory. Because if it had been unsatisfactory, I don't know what would have happened, but anyway, it was deemed to be a satisfactory performance, and so we left out there. And then we went up to, from New Guinea, we went up to the Admiralty Islands, which I thought was probably the most beautiful island in the Pacific. White sandy beaches and palm trees and so forth and so on. And we went to a place called Manus, M-A-N-U-S, which is one of the islands in the Admiralty chain, for a beer stop. And I don't know how many thousands of GIs were on the island, but from all these ships that were out in the harbor there, I couldn't figure out how they found out, how we found out which ship, how we were going to get back to the ships, but somehow or another it all worked out. That we had a couple of beers there and yak for a while.
Was the beer cold?
I don't remember. The trouble with beer, it was only 3.2. You know, it was like almost water. That under the rules, Army rules, that was
as high as it could go?
that was as far as you could go.
I've heard stories that you would make your own
No,
hooch.
well, that was on. Most of that was done on Luzon.
How would you make it?
Well, they did it with potato peels and I don't know what else, some other things that they'd scrounged from the mess hall. The trouble with that was if you made the wrong, had the wrong mixture, it'd kill you, or you would go blind or something like that. So you had to be real careful. But they had to be real careful. I didn't drink it and didn't make any. But there were some people who were alcoholics and they just had to have it. So the most popular guy for them were the medics, because they had this medical alcohol that they carried. So you get big bucks for that.
So after you guys had your 2 or 3 beers,
Yeah.
then where did you go?
Then they were waiting for the convoy to form, to go on up to Luzon. And in this let's see here, this convoy was made up of 818 ships, divided into 10 groups based on function, and it included 7 battleships.
I was going to ask what kind of ships. What kind of ship were you on?
I was on an AP, an attack personnel something or another, APT, is that what it was called? Something like that. I was on a ship called the, let's see what the ship was that on, the Alpine, USS Alpine. And it just so happened that it earlier had been involved in the invasion of Leyte, and a few months earlier. And this was about the time that the Japanese were moving to suicide planes. It was the first time that they encountered suicide planes. And the Alpine was one of the ships that was hit by a suicide plane. And the Jap plane hit the ship on the side, punctured the bulkhead, and skidded across the mess hall. This was hit about 7:30 in the morning, skidded across the mess hall and bounced up on the bulkhead on the other side. And it killed about 6 and wounded 12. And then after this attack, they had to go someplace to get fixed up. And then they came down to Bougainville and picked us up. And then from there we went on to Luzon.
So how long did it take you to get from the Three Bears to Luzon?
I don't know, it wasn't very long. It wasn't very long. At that time, this was the largest convoy that had been involved in the war. Over 800 ships. It was a big convoy. And the day we got to Luzon, I was standing on the deck waiting to go down the rope ladder, and they played a recorded from General MacArthur. In effect, he said, "We're going to put you ashore." He said, "Japs give you a hard time. In effect, you're going to have to stay and fight it out because the Navy won't be able to come in and pick you up for about 3 or 4 days because of the tides." And I could see the shore, and I really wasn't worried because it was all flat land. And we had these 7 battleships out there, and I knew that no one would try and defend the flat beach, unlike on Normandy, where you had big cliffs and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so they also were afraid that the Japs were going to use poison gas to try and stop the invasion. So everybody had a gas mask in addition to all the other things they carried. And so when I got to the beach, I looked around, there was all these gas masks laying on the beach because you had enough to carry anyway. So I figured, well, I'll take mine. I took my gas mask off and threw it on the beach like everybody else, and we took off.
Where'd you go?
Interior, to the inside, to the interior. We were heading for Clark Field.
So that's past Luzon?
That's
in the middle of the Philippine island?
Yeah. And then also, when we got ashore, there were a bunch of Navy SEALs that were kind of along the beach there just in case anybody got into difficulties getting ashore. And the way it worked, they had carried your pack, but it wasn't really buckled. It was just sitting on your shoulders, which meant that if you got into the water and you had to get rid of the weight, you just flipped your pack off and took your helmet off, and you still had a lot of weight, your boots and clothes and everything, but at least you didn't have this big pack on there.
So did anyone get in trouble getting to shore?
I think some did. That's why they had the Navy frogmen there.
Did you know how to swim?
No. So I made sure that I didn't get into trouble.
Or you stayed near a seal?
No, I just saw them there. It was when we landed. You could hear these battleships and the cruisers were firing at targets way inland, and this a 15-inch shell flying over your head sounded like a freight car. I don't know how many rounds they fired, but anyway, they also had people from the Navy were assigned to infantry units, and they were these to direct fire from these ships, and they stayed with us for about 15 miles after they got out of range of the battleships, which is about their maximum, 15, 17 miles. Then they went back to the ship, and then I lost my Air Force guy because he didn't have any targets to worry about, so he went back to the Air Force, and I continued with
The colonel?
the colonel.
Is this the colonel you've been writing to, or had been writing to?
No, that's another one.
Different one? What was this colonel's name? The one you worked for?
Colonel that I was often rode with, his name was Whitcomb, or Wyndham, Lorne Wyndham, Lorenwindom. Just so happened that before the war he was a district attorney in someplace in Florida. Very professional. When he went to the front, I went to the front, and that was every day. Because he usually said, "We can't see anything back here, Nagy, we gotta go up to the front."
So what did you see at the front?
Chaos. Chaos.
What was happening?
Well, they, as I say, they kept pushing the Japs back, and when we got ashore, MacArthur had a meeting with the division commanders, and actually there were I think about 10 divisions involved in the landing in Luzon. But anyway, the two of the main divisions was the 37th and the 1st Cavalry, and we were on parallel highways heading for Manila. We were on one highway and the 1st Cav was on the other highway. And MacArthur had a meeting with the two generals. He said, "I want you guys to get to Manila as fast as you can, because in Manila they had something like 4,000 dependents, mostly women and children, who were there when the Japs came in 1941, and they were being housed in a University of Santo Tomas. They lived there all the 4 years, and they were afraid that the Japs were going to kill them. And so MacArthur wanted to get to Manila as fast as we could to make sure that that didn't happen.
So you landed on Luzon, which is on one side of the Philippines, and you had to go all the way across to the
We
other
had
side
to go
to get
to the other side,
Manila.
which is, Manila was on the other side. And so the 1st Cav got there the day before we did. And we arrived the next day, and they rescued all the people at the university there.
Did you encounter any resistance in your...
I didn't, but the line companies did.
What's a line company?
Those were the infantry, like well, they had line companies, and then they had heavy weapons companies. The line companies were essentially infantry, and then the heavy weapons were the machine guns and the mortars and things like that.
So the line company goes out first,
Yeah.
and then the machine guns are backup?
Well, sometimes the machine gunners are with them, depending on what the deal is, what the opposition is doing.
So you never had to do that because you were carrying a radio.
Yeah, yeah.
Did anyone ever shoot at you?
Yeah, now that you mention it. One day the colonel and I were riding into Baguio, which was the summer capital of the Philippines. And one of the nice things about Baguio, it was kind of like a summer resort. It was up in the mountains, because it got real hot in Manila in the summer, and a lot of the officials went up to Baguio for the summer. And so, I don't know why we were going to Baguio, but anyway, as we're going into Baguio, I was riding in the back of the Jeep with my radio, and the colonel was sitting in front, and it was just quiet. It was just so peaceful and quiet. Didn't see anybody. It was a real eerie day. And the next thing you knew, there were some mortar shells were starting to land on the road in front of us. And so the driver slammed on the Jeep, and the colonel got out, and I got out and got under the Jeep, I don't know where the colonel went, but anyway, these mortar shells start falling, and one of the mortar shells, piece of the mortar shell, landed right next to where I was laying down, and it was gray, and I reached out to touch it, and it was red hot. It was red hot, piece of steel about an inch long. I reached out to grab it, and I didn't grab it very long because they said it was still red hot. But anyway, I let it cool down, and I put it in my pocket and carried it around as a souvenir and brought it home. And finally I said, what am I doing keeping this piece of shrapnel? And I tossed it someplace. It's all gone.
So you were only shot or shelled at once?
As far as I know, yeah.
Even with that?
That was the closest I think it came.
So no snipers ever tried to get you?
Who?
Snipers?
No, never ran into a sniper.
That's good.
We did run into a Jap roadblock once, and we came upon it about 6, 7 o'clock at night, and the traffic was starting to pile up, and we got there and stopped, and the colonel says, well, wait here, I'll go up and see what's happening. And he went up, came back about 5 minutes later. He said, there's a Jap roadblock up there. He says, we can't do anything more tonight. He said, let's just stay here and we'll worry about it in the morning. So we stayed there the night, and about daybreak, all hell broke loose. They had the Air Force there, and they had 155s, artillery pieces were firing, and in about 5 minutes they'd broken through this roadblock up there, and we continued on after that.
So you were going to Manila?
Yeah.
So what happened once you got to Manila?
What happened was that we got to Manila, and what MacArthur was hoping was that he would have a grand parade after the city had been taken, because when the war first started and the Japs got there, they declared it an open city, which means you do not defend the city, you take all your military stuff out.
Who declared it an open city?
The U.S. did.
Okay.
And so MacArthur was hoping that the Japanese would declare Manila an open city, but they didn't do that. The city was commanded by an admiral, and he said, no, I'm not going to declare it an open city, so you're going to have to come and get us. And so they started a battle of attrition. Anyway, MacArthur wanted to try and preserve some of these landmarks from Manila, and so he sent an order out, no artillery and no Air Force. And so about the first week we got there, the casualties were mounting like crazy, and the general said, you can't tolerate that. You can't keep on going like this. And so he went and see MacArthur. He said, you got to lift that ban on artillery and air power. He said, our casualties are running too high. He said, made some comment to MacArthur. He said, you wouldn't want the American people to know that you're more concerned about preserving landmarks than you were about preserving the life of American troops. And so MacArthur said, okay, go ahead. And so they just, after that, they just
Leveled it?
leveled the town almost. There wasn't anything left of Manila when they got through.
So what's this battle of attrition you mentioned?
The Battle of Attrition?
Mm-hmm. What is that?
I don't know. Write down somebody.
What was the Japanese wouldn't fight you on the beach? So what was their defensive
Their
plan?
idea was that they were going to keep kind of just trying to limit it as much as we could until there wasn't anything left, and then they were going to take off into the hills and fight from there. There's a lot of mountains in Luzon. They were going to go up into the mountains, and that's the way. In fact, that they had the army people were commanded by General Yamashita, and the Navy was commanded by this admiral, and they didn't talk to each other. Each one had their own spheres of influence, and the Navy didn't have to do what the Army said, and the Army didn't have to do what the Navy did. But Yamashita was in favor of declaring Manila an open city, and the admiral said, no, we're not going to do that. And so the general took his people and they went up to the hills, up into the mountains, the Sierra Madre Mountains, and the Japs fought it out in the city, which was a disaster for the civilians and also for the Japs. There were 100,000 Japs that were almost massacred by the Japs. We were coming from this side, and back of the Japs was the Manila Bay, so they had no place to go. They were up against the ocean there. And in the middle were the poor Filipinos. And so before it was over, 100,000 Filipinos were dead, and I think it was 16,000 Japs were killed before the last one died. And for every day, the American forces used 7 tons of ammo to take that city, 7 tons. And there were some days when they were running low on certain types of ammo, and they said, sent a notice around, okay, kind of go easy on artillery or whatever. They were running low until we got to get more ammo up here. And they couldn't use Manila Harbor because there all kinds of ships were sunk out there, so they had to build a railroad from Manila down to the beach on the other side of the island, where they were brought in their supplies, and they built this railroad track, and then they started bringing ammunition up after that.
So you were involved in the battle for Manila?
Yeah,
What, all you did was radio things back and forth
yeah,
for the colonel?
yeah.
How long did the battle last?
Quite a while, quite a while. We had about 1,000 people killed from our division in Manila. 800 to 1,000 were killed there. Altogether, the division lost over 1,800 killed and 8,000 wounded in 3 battles. I was only in the last 2. I wasn't there for New Georgia.
Did you know anyone that died
Yeah,
during that time?
I knew the guy who was killed the first day.
Oh,
I still remember his name.
what was his name?
I'll tell you before this
Okay.
is all over.
Was that the guy who threw the hand grenade?
Yeah.
Is that,
He was from Cleveland, Ohio. He's from Cleveland, Ohio. And for whatever reason, the parents didn't bring his body home after the war. And he's buried in the cemetery, military cemetery in Manila, which is the largest American cemetery in the Pacific. All the graves were consolidated into this one big one. 15,000 bodies are buried in this Manila cemetery, 5 miles outside the city there. One of the other things I should mention about this mortar crew was that one of the guys was named Roger Menzer, and he was from our Fort Knox days, and he was my best friend in the military. And I guess I was kind of sorry to leave him when I went to radio school, but anyway, I went. And then in the battle for Manila, during street fighting, he got hit with a ricocheting bullet in the face, and it tore out part of his face, and he lost an eye in the process, and they took one look at him, and they thought that his other eye might go out in sympathy. So they bandaged his head up, threw him on an airplane, and flew him to Denver, Colorado, to one of the best eye specialists in the country. And they saved his eye.
the one that hadn't been hit?
Yeah, saved his eye, and eventually gave him a false eye. And so his fighting days were over, so he left the Army. We got back home. He was from a little town called Wapakoneta, which is near Lima, Ohio. And he got his old job back. He was a superintendent in a foundry. And shortly after he got back, the foundry went bankrupt. And then in addition, his wife died of breast cancer. So he had a kind of a hard time after he got home.
Are you still in touch with him? Is he still alive?
Last time we went to Wisconsin, we stopped to see them up there, and he's been down here too. So he's still alive and well. He's getting his Army pension, disability pay.
So what year was the Battle of Manila?
44.
The whole year?
Well,
Pretty much.
we landed in January 9th or something like that, and then we were there until the war ended.
How many months or years were you at Luzon?
Well, we were there almost a year. Then after we took Manila, the army, the Jap army fled into the mountains, and we took after them. One of the reasons we went after them was that there was a couple of water reservoirs in these mountains, and they were afraid that maybe the Japs were going to poison the water. These reservoirs were used to provide the water supply for Manila. And so we took off after them up there, but they never did poison the water. And we're still after them when the war ended. And you'd go from one mountain top to the other. And I recall standing on one hill, one mountain, looking down into the valley. The Japs they'd back off and they'd go over to the next hill and build fortifications or caves or whatever. And you could stand on this hill and look down and see these holes on the side of the mountain there. And they thought we were going to come after them. But that's kind of a stupid. So what they did, they brought up anti-aircraft guns on these hills, 40mm anti-aircraft guns, and fired down into these caves. So they knocked out every one of these caves with 40mm anti-aircraft guns. And I recall one day, I stand up there and I hear the roar of engines, and I look down and here's a flight of bombers, 2-engine bombers, that were flying through this gorge. And I could look down there and see that they were down and they're firing on these boxes, fill boxes that were on the hill. And so that was so unusual to stand up there and look down and see these bombers flying through the canyon there. One of the other rules was that the Japs operated at night, we operated in the daytime. And so when we got into the mountains, the colonel came up with a great idea. Rather than try and do it in the daytime, we're going to do it at night. And the Japs never expected that the Americans were going to fight at night, and so the colonel said, okay, what we're going to do in the night, I want you guys to get up on these hills, and when the morning comes, you got all these grenades, let them have it in these caves. And so the American troops crawled up the hill at night. Japs thought, we don't operate at night, so they went up in the morning and they had a handful of, they got a mouthful of grenades that were tossed at them. So that's how I got rid of those.
What was the weather like on the Philippines? Better than
The what?
the weather?
The weather was a lot nicer. It was tank country, which was a lot better than the jungle. They did have tanks in the jungle, but you couldn't do very much with them.
So how did you tell the Japanese from the Filipino communities?
We didn't, but the Filipinos did.
They would turn them in?
They would turn them in. But after Manila fell, the surviving Filipinos were walking through the American lines, and sometime you'd see, they'd say, hey, there's one there, a Jap soldier or somebody who had collaborated with the Japs was walking through, and they went over and grabbed him, just beat the hell out of him.
The Filipinos did?
Yeah, because they knew who they were. And then there were some Japs that also tried to get through the lines, and one of the guys was telling me that he was standing on the corner talking to a Philippine officer who was in uniform, and he said, "If we talking," the guy said, "Just a minute," and he turned around and left and walked into the middle of the street and pulled out his pistol and shot a guy dead in the middle of the street. He said, "That's a Japanese soldier." He said, "He's not a Filipino." And so he came back to the street corner and resumed his conversation and let the guy out in the middle of the road there.
So did many Japanese surrender?
I think about 10.
Not very many. So they never captured prisoners or anything
Never
like that?
captured very many. When the war was over, I was there when the General Yamashita surrendered. And so when the war ended, they sent word to the General Yamashita that the war's over, you can come down now, bring your troops out of there. And our general was assigned to accept all the surrender of troops in the Philippines. And the deal from MacArthur was no surrender is to take place until after signing of the surrender aboard the Missouri. And so after we got the word that the surrender had taken place in the Missouri, then an effort made to start rounding up these Japs. And anyway, I finally got word to Yamashita, and he said, okay, I'll be down at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning or whatever it was with my troops. And so I'm standing there, and here coming out of the mountains is 6 guys carrying a sedan chair, and on this chair is riding General Yamashita. It's kind of stupid, but anyway, that's the way the Japs did it. So they bring this chair down there and get down the middle of this field, and they put him down, and Yamashita steps off of the chair and pulls his tunic down, kind of gets all spruced up a little bit, you know. And so he starts walking over to where our general was standing. The general was standing at the side of the road waiting to accept the surrender. And Yamashita walks over this guy and salutes our general and extends his hand to shake his hand. And the American general says, I don't shake hands with war criminals. And he turned around and walked away. And poor Yamashita standing there embarrassed. Get his hand out, salute him. So anyway, that's how the war ended. Then I heard later that as these Japs were coming down out of the hills there was a colonel standing there. I don't know what his duty was, but anyway, when they all came down, he walked over to one of the big Jap officers and he says, is this all your men? Well, he said, you must have some more. Well, where's the rest of them? And the Jap officer says, well, yeah, he said, we did have some more. He said, we left all the sick and wounded up in the hills. You can't walk. He said, just stay there and die. And this American officer got really ticked off. He said, you get your ass back up there with your men and get these soldiers. I said, I want every one of them down here. So the guy said, okay. He turned around, got his head, they went back up in the hills and brought all these sick and wounded down. Otherwise, you just left them there to die. That's the way they treated their people. It's terrible.
So how many Japanese eventually came down out of the mountains?
Quite a few. Quite a few. I got pictures of some of them there.
And what was the name of the American general?
Beetler. He's the commanding general.
So who finally accepted Yamashita's surrender?
He did.
The general did finally?
Well, what happened was they took him down to Manila was destroyed, there wasn't anything there, so they took him to Baguio. And Yamashita wasn't aware that it was unconditional surrender. So when they got to Baguio, he kept saying, well, I'm ready to start negotiating the surrender. And they said, there is no negotiation, it's unconditional surrender. And it's like he didn't understand it or didn't believe it. He said, well, I'm ready to start negotiating. And finally, they had a Jap interpreter there. He said, you tell Yamashita it's unconditional surrender and he's going to sign this surrender document or else. And so Yamashita finally surrounded the surrender document.
All right, stop for a minute. Just let it run for a minute.
Poor Yamashita was accused of every wrongdoing that every Jap soldier ever did. They say they accused him of being responsible for the Bataan Death March, and it was some other officer and so forth and so on. Anyway, he was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, and he asked to be shot instead, and they turned him down. And so he got hung. And I guess if we'd have lost the war, MacArthur would have been tried as a war criminal too. So then when the war ended, the question was, gotta go home. and everybody wanted to get home, and so they finally decided on a system of points. So many points for being overseas every month, so many points for certain awards, and so forth and so on. And I think the maximum number of points that you had, the minimum number of points to qualify for shipment home was 60. And I already had 61, 69 or whatever. So I was included in the first batch. And if you didn't go home, they packed you up and sent you to Japan as part of the Army of Occupation. And so we're waiting for a ship, and there's a lot of pressure on the government because everybody wanted to get home. And finally, they sent a Dutch freighter that they had chartered, and we got on this Dutch freighter and headed for San Pedro, California. And every day while we were at sea, they had a big chart on deck and said, this is where we are. Yesterday we traveled X number of miles, and we have X number of miles to go. So you know exactly where we were. And then we got to San Pedro, got off the ship, there, a great big sign, welcome home. And from there we went to a place called Camp Anza, which was outside of San Pedro, and stayed there for a couple of days. And then I eventually wound up at Camp Atterbury in Indianapolis, and was discharged there. And
What year was this?
1945. I got home on Christmas Eve.
They have presents waiting for you?
I didn't tell them I was coming.
Ah!
So I got home about 3 o'clock in the morning, banging on the door.
And what did Grandma do?
She said, hi. In the dining room, she had a table like this and had a great big map of the Pacific Theater. And she used to tell my sister, here's where Alex is today. So funny.
Can I back up a little bit?
Yeah.
When you were in Manila
Yeah.
and you had your 60 points,
Yeah.
did they ever ask you if you wanted to stay?
They did at Camp Atterbury.
Oh, you could have gone back?
When I was being discharged, they said, would you like to join the Ready Reserve or whatever it was? I said, no, that's okay.
And how?
Because I had already decided what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to college and be a journalist.
Because of your radio background?
Well, that's something that somehow or another I always felt that's what I wanted to do. And so, no, I didn't want to stay in the Army. And then there's a couple of guys from my outfit did stay, and then they were recalled during the Korean War, and it was a disaster for them. Because it didn't matter what your MOS was, you got off the ship in Korea and they gave you a rifle and said, you're in the rifle company, up to the front.
What's MOS?
Huh?
MOS?
Military occupational skill. That's your job.
So it didn't matter whether you're a radio operator or whatever, you're just an infantryman carrying a rifle.
When you were in Manila, did you hear any news about dropping the atom bombs in Japan?
Yeah, that's where we were all for it, you know, and still for it.
Did you have lots of news? Did you get newspapers and things like that, or was it all listening to radios?
Our next assignment was going to be the invasion of Japan. Our division was going to invade Kyushu, which was the Japanese most southern island. And one of the things they were afraid of was the Russians were going to come in from the north and gobble up Japan. So they were always concerned about that. But anyway, I didn't have to go to Japan.
Do you ever hear Tokyo Rose?
Yeah, we did hear. It's kind of interesting, you know, humorous. And didn't believe anything she said, but it's just kind of humorous the way she carried on, played music for us, you know, things like that. I did see, in Manila, I got down to the University of San Tomas where all these prisoners were being held. And they had some people who were in the Spanish-American War who had decided, rather than come back to the States, that they were gonna live in the Philippines. And they were part of the prisoner group there. And it was interesting because for one day, they were in the global spotlight. You know, all the reporters were there and taking pictures, and the next day, the war moved on. You know, that was it. That was it for them.
Did you have any reporters with you?
No.
You were too far back? Too far behind the
There
main-
might have been there, but I didn't see them wherever they were. They were the division headquarters or whatever.
Did they monitor your letters home and stuff like that?
Yeah, yeah. We had V-mail. Rather than sending this in an envelope, they took a picture of it. And what you would get and what they would get at home would be a little condensed,
Like a photocopy?
yeah, and that's what you would get.
So you'd need a little magnifying glass to read the print?
Well, not quite, but almost.
So then someone would read it and edit it if something needed to be crossed
Well,
out?
usually it was your CO would read your letters, and so you couldn't put down, I don't know, I didn't send very much. I said, well, we're here in the South Pacific and nothing to write about. Love, goodbye, and that was the end of it.
So you couldn't say where you were or anything about your unit or anything like that?
No. So it was almost like, what's the bother writing other than to let them know that you're still alive? So I got out before I was 21 years old, which was great for me because I went into the Army, had my 3 years in, had all this time with the GI Bill. And so I went to all the way through undergrad and grad school on the GI Bill and didn't pay a dime.
Were you 17 when you went in?
18,
18.
yeah. So as I say, the war just came at the right time for me because I was out before I was 21. And but then when I got to college, got to Ohio University, I had to make up all these high school credits that I didn't have to take at the vocational school. All the math, 4-credit courses for no credit.
Developmental studies.
Yeah. So I didn't care because it was all paid for by the government anyway, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I kind of had that as my vision out there, so I didn't care.
Did you get any awards or medals while you were in the Army?
Got the Good Conduct Medal.
Didn't you get something with a little rifle on it?
Yeah, that was a combat infantry badge. And the way that came about was that the Air Force had whatever it was, some kind of award that after you flew 5 missions or whatever, you automatically get this whatever it was. And so George Marshall said, well, that's not really quite fair. He said, we got to get something for the people in the infantry. So they came up with this idea of the combat infantry badge. And the deal was that once you fired your gun in anger, you qualified for a combat infantry badge. And so that's where that came out.
So what are the medals or with the different color ribbons on them? What's that from?
Those are different theaters. Like they had the ribbon for the Asiatic Pacific Theater, and then they had the Korean or the Philippine Liberation Medal, and so forth and so on that you wore. And then there's a star on a couple of stars. Those are battles that you're involved in. As I say, I was involved in 2 of them.
How was the food when you were in the Army?
Well, it wasn't too bad. Once we got settled on the perimeter on Bougainville, then it wasn't too bad. Then we started living in tents and on cots and things like that. I remember the first Thanksgiving on Bougainville. I've forgotten when we went up there, but anyway, the first Thanksgiving, as usual, it was raining like hell. And I remember standing in line for my turkey dinner and had my poncho on, and it was raining, and I had my mess kit in the cup, and where they were serving was under a big tent. But then after you got your food, you had to go out into the rain again. So went to this tent there, and they had canned turkey. Did you ever have any of that canned turkey? And canned mashed potatoes and coffee. And so I had a tray full of canned turkey and mashed potatoes, and I stepped out into the rain. And so I'm eating my turkey out in the rain, and just raining like hell.
You should have made a little tent with your poncho.
Yeah. As I say, it was miserable, you know, raining all the time, you were wet all the time, you couldn't get dry. So, wouldn't want to do that too often.
I know when you were over there, you were bitten by a mosquito and got malaria.
Yeah.
When, in this 3-year time period, when did that happen?
Well, during the war, we ran out of quinine because the Japs controlled where quinine was built or manufactured or provided. The Japs had controlled all the supply. And so they developed a substitute called Atterbren. And you had to take your Atterbren pill every day. And some people didn't take their Atterbren every day, and then you came down with malaria. And so what they usually did was you took your Atterbren when you went to eat, and somebody was standing there making sure that you took your Atterbren as you went through the chow line. But anyway, the Atterbren made your skin real yellow for whatever reason because of the chemical they had in there. And then when I got home, then of course I stopped taking Atterbren, and a short time later I came down with malaria.
So you had the bug in you already, and the
Yeah.
Atterbro was just suppressing
You
it.
know, the Atterbren just suppressed the symptoms, didn't come out. And so, in fact, I recall going to a doctor in Akron, and he said, "Gee, I can't figure out what the problem is, what your problem is." And I said, "Well, it might be malaria." He said, "Oh, yeah." So he reaches up and pulls down a big book and something. "Oh, yeah, you got malaria."
So what did they do for you?
What?
The doctor, was there anything they could give you?
Oh, they gave me aspirin.
That's it?
That's it.
Because I remember when we were kids that it was, you always wanted to be in a dark room. You had really bad headaches.
Yeah. I could have qualified for a pension, partial disability, $8 a month. And the deal was that I'd have to go to the VA hospital. There was between Akron and Cleveland, a little town called Bexville, I think. You had to go up to the VA hospital and get tested every month to make sure that you still had the bug in you. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to do that," so I didn't even apply for a pension. $8 a month, and you keep it.
Well, what was it? Did Grandma Nagy know that you were coming home?
No,
I mean, but she didn't even know you were in the United States.
no.
You weren't allowed to call her or anything
Yeah,
like
you
that?
were allowed to, but I just, for whatever reason, I didn't call.
Was she mad at you?
No, she wasn't bad.
Did you keep a diary or anything?
No, I
No?
should have. That's one of my big,
Could have made,
could have,
written a book.
yeah, I should have kept a diary. I don't know anybody who did, though.
So how, I know you wanted to become a journalist, but what in the Army sparked that to become a journalist?
I don't know.
Or wasn't it
I had
the
decided I wanted to do that before I even went into the Army.
Was it from working at the printing press?
There was a reporter on the Akron Beacon Journal that I kind of admired. It was, in fact, it was a woman reporter. And so I thought, oh, that's something I'd like to do. And so I always had my eyes set on becoming a journalist.
So did you get your GED first?
Yeah.
And then you went, what university did you go to?
Well, first I went to a 2-year college in Texas called Hardin College, Hardin.
How'd you get down
And the
there?
reason I got there was that when I was in high school, my printing teacher was the guy who really encouraged me quite a bit because he knew my dad had died, and there were a lot of dark days, you know, after that. And so he kind of kept encouraging me, you gotta da 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 da. And so when I got back from service, he had already left Akron and was teaching at this college, 2-year college in Wichita Falls. He said, why don't you come down here, go to school? So I went down there and did my first year, and then I left to come back to Akron and go to Ohio University for the other 3 years.
So what did you get your undergraduate degree in? Journalism?
Journalism, yeah.
So is that a BS?
Yeah.
And what happened after you got your BS degree?
After that, I went to, got a job in Osage at the Press News.
How'd you find out about the job in Osage?
Well, the publisher of the Press News had a brother who was on the faculty at Ohio University, and they called back and forth. And one day he told his brother at Ohio University that they had an opening. And so they put it up on the board, and I thought, oh, well, sounds kind of interesting, so went out.
And what was the name of the Osage, Iowa paper?
Press News,
Okay.
Press News.
Let's go back to the war for a minute. What was the one thing that you missed the most when you were out of the country, and when you got back, what was the thing that you liked the best coming back?
Well, I don't know, I wanted to get back and start going to school, and I don't know, when I was in the Army, you know, every time we did something, I felt, well, that's good, because it's one day closer to the end of the war. And a bunch of Japs were dead, well, that's good, because it's just closer to the end of the war. And when we were in New Caledonia, Admiral Halsey had his headquarters there in New Caledonia for a while. And he had a great big banner in the front of his place that said, "Kill Japs," semicolon. And he had the same philosophy, you know, the more Japs we kill, the sooner we're going to go home.
Did you miss any home comforts while you were in the Army?
Home comforts?
Like a hot shower.
Ice cream, hot shower.
Yeah, I kind of miss all that, especially on Bougainville. You know, you were in the jungle, you didn't have any of that. So.
When you were on the boat coming back, did you say to yourself, the first thing I do when I get back to the United States is I'm going to go have a steak or something like that?
Well, the first thing I wanted to do, I had a bad tooth. I wanted to get that taken care of. That's the first thing I did when I got home. I called the dentist, got that taken care of. And then I still had a bad case of acne. And so I wanted to get that taken care of. And I recall going to this dermatologist in Akron, and I said, "You're talking about the war." And I said, you know, they had all these, people came down with these rashes, skin rashes. It would start on your arm and work up your arm and up into your neck and up into your face. And finally, it got so bad that they had to send you out of the combat zone. And he said they didn't know what it was. They called it jungle rot. He said, yeah, I was in the service too. He said, every time we found something like that that we didn't know what it was, we called it jungle rot. So, but anyway.
So did you ever have any food that did not come out of a can while you were in the Army? Like, did they slaughter a cow or something?
Oh, yeah, not there in the Philippines we did. You could get chickens and things like that in the Philippines. And some people were like Stephen, they were good cooks. They knew how to make it. One of the things we did on Bougainville was you could look down into these streams and see fish down in there. So what you do is take a hand grenade, throw it down into the pool there, and then it would explode into concussion. These fish would turn over on their back and float to the surface, and so you go in and scoop them out.
So you had fresh fish.
Well, some people knew how to fish them. One of the things you could not do was put your head underwater in Bougainville, because it had microbes or whatever in the water that would cause you to go deaf. And so they said, don't put your head underwater.
What about the locals? Did you ever see any local people in Bougainville?
Yeah, we saw some of the natives. They the Fijis, Fiji Island wasn't too far away, and they had some of these Fijis who joined the army. They were called Fiji Scouts, and they were the most ornery looking people you ever saw, and they were about 6'2" and had big bushy hair. And they just hated the Japs, and they never carried guns, but they carried this big long knife. And they said they'd go out to the bush and look for Japs. Anyway, we had those. In addition, they had something called coast watchers. These were usually Australians who, prior to the war, were like Coconut Grove and Pineapple and things like that. And after the war, they kind of fled into the bush and had radios, and they spied on the Japs for Americans. And so they would say, just saw a flight of Jap planes going north from wherever, and so they would pick up the signal in New Caledonia and then relay it to where they thought these planes were going, to Guadalcanal or whatever, and so they'd be ready when these planes got there. So they were a real valuable asset, these coast watchers. Some of them were captured and killed and tortured by the Japs, but there were some of them that managed to stay free all during the war.
So the natives were glad that the Americans were there,
Yeah.
and the Filipinos the same way.
The big mistake that the Japs made, they treated the natives like dirt. Even in the Philippines, you know. If they'd have been nice to those people, they could have been a big help to the Japs, but they weren't. They treated them like crap. And so when they came, a lot of them went underground, a lot of them did sabotage work and whatever, and so that's why they hated the Filipinos and killed a lot of them in the Battle of Manila.
So in the Philippines, would you meet, like, the local people they were glad the Americans were there and treated you nicely?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what the instructions were. Treat the natives nice. One of the things that I was always looking for was a souvenir to send to this teacher in Akron that I had kind of admired. And I knew I wasn't going to buy one because what happened was that the Filipinos, they knew that Americans wanted souvenirs, so they'd take a piece of white cloth and paint a big red circle on it and say, hey, here's a Jap flag for you, $15, you know, whatever. So I wasn't going to buy anything. And I wasn't going to go through a dead body of a Jap to find something. But the Filipinos didn't mind. You know, there'd be 20 dead Japs out in the field, and these Filipinos would walk out into the field, and they'd either cut their pockets open or take all the clothes off of these dead Japs and walk off. And you need a gas mask to be 15 miles from that place because the smell was just so terrible. But they didn't mind, they just walked right out into the field there to do that. And not only that, the Japs had like to booby trap their bodies. So, you know, very easy to do with a hand grenade. Pull the pin, stick it under a body, and you roll the body over, and the thing goes off. So there was always a danger of that, but the Filipinos didn't care. They didn't do that. So anyway, I was looking for a souvenir, and after we captured the presidential palace in Manila, I said there must be something in there. So I went through this palace from top to bottom, and the Japs had already cleaned it out. So there wasn't too much left in there. I didn't want to take a chandelier to send to this guy. So finally I wound up in the library, and they left all the old crappy books there. And to get out of there, I just picked a book off the shelf and wrapped it up and sent it off to this guy. I hope he threw it away because I didn't think it was very useful. So anyway, that's the closest I got to getting him a souvenir. And he didn't mention it when I got back from the war, and I didn't mention it either, so
Maybe it never got to him.
maybe it never got to him, yeah. A couple of dead Japs in the swimming pool, but someone else would have to go through their pockets, not me.
Did Americans get in trouble over there? Did people get in trouble for doing stupid stuff?
Yeah, yeah. They kind of looked the other way though, a lot of that stuff. After the war was over, and the attitude of the Filipinos changed quite a bit. A lot of them had no use for the GIs, and once in a while we'd go into Manila, and we'd never go alone. Never go into Manila alone. You always went with 3 or 4 people, and you always carried a loaded .45 pistol inside your jacket, because what they did sometimes was they'd see you driving down a highway, and they would stop, take your Jeep from you, and break it up and sell it for parts. So you didn't want to be caught in a situation like that. So whenever we went into Manila, we always went armed.
So what did, after you became a newspaper man in Iowa,
Yeah.
and where'd you go after you, I know you, what'd you do in Iowa?
Well, then I got married and I went to work for the mill. And then the mill was doing very poorly, and so I felt that I was a drain on the assets, and so I felt what I really ought to do is do something to leave. And so I left the mill, and there wasn't anything left in town for me to do, so I became a fully press salesman for a while. And I knew we didn't want to do that very long. And I was telling your mother that, you know, maybe the best thing for me to do is, went to school for 4 years, maybe I ought to go and find a job in journalism. How about that?
Imagine that.
And so we went to Monticello, and I was a reporter on the paper there.
Is that also in Iowa?
That's in southern Iowa. And the deal was only going to stay there long enough to move to a bigger paper. And I was there about 6 months, and I got a call from Uncle Eddie in Wisconsin. He said, there's an opening on the Sheboygan Press. Would you be interested in applying for it? And so I said, sure. And so I went over and had the interview with Harry Meyer, and got hired.
And how long were you there?
9 years.
Wow.
The press was really a great newspaper. And I recall after I was there for about 3 months, you know, there was a guild paper, a union paper. And they had a scare you started this, and you had so many years of service, you get this. And one day Harry Meyer, the managing editor, called me, and he said, I don't think you can live on the salary that we're paying you. He said, we've decided we're going to boot you up a couple levels and give you more money. And I thought, gee, hey, how about that? So I got a raise in salary.
How many children were born by that time?
Well, I see, only had you, and Robert was born in Monticello. Just as we moved. He was still in the hospital. They wouldn't let him out until he reached 4 pounds 3 ounces. And so when he was born, he was about 3 ounces and something, I guess. So he was there for a couple of weeks after we left, and then we went back and picked him up. And so the rest of you were born in a place called
That's right.
Sheboygan.
So what made you decide to leave the press and go back to school and get another degree?
Well, then they opened the campus, and one day the dean came down to talk to Harry Meyer, and he said he'd really like to have somebody from the press come out and handle publicity for them. He said, you got somebody who might be interested? And so Harry called me up to his office one day. He said, hey, he just got a call from the dean at the campus there, looking for someone to do a little publicity for them. Would you be interested? I said, sure. So I went out, and on my day off, I worked at the campus. And after the first year, the dean said, would you like to come work for us full-time? Half-time public relations and half-time teaching with a big increase in salary. So I said, sure. And I went, but the deal was I had to get a master's degree in 3 years.
Who was the dean then? I don't
Earl
remember.
Beard. Earl Beard. And so then I went to summer school that first year, Madison, and then then we went back, I guess, I don't know, I finally got the master's degree. They said, oh, you can't do anything with just a master's degree in higher education. You gotta get a PhD, so why don't you just stay? And so I got to know some people who were handling public information in Madison, and they finagled a place for us in Eagle Heights. And so the fall semester came, we just packed up, went to Madison for a year, or a semester, which was it?
It was a year.
A year. I got my residency in, and we went back to Sheboygan.
When you look back on after you got out of the military, would you say that it was was there any advantage to having been in the military? I mean, other than the GI Bill?
Yeah, I think you really learned a lot about people, how to get along for one, and we found out that there were all kinds of different people that make up this thing that we call the world. You know, one of the things that I was always surprised about was, you know, I always thought we were so poor because we'd come out of the Depression. And I thought we were the only ones who were poor, went to the Army, come to find out everybody else was poor too, had come from a poor background. And so most of the people who were in World War II came out of the Depression.
How about when you got home? Like as far as getting jobs and things like that, wasn't it an
Well, the
advantage?
deal was that you automatically could get your old job back if you wanted it. I didn't want my old job back because I was working as a flunky in a print shop at the Goodrich Company, and so I didn't want to do that. So then I started working on my GED and things like that. Eventually got that out of the way, and then I got serious about going to school.
But as far as getting to get a different job, it wasn't. Did they give favoritism to people that had been in the military?
Yeah, usually if you applied for a government job, you got a 15-point preference. And so a lot of people who came out of the war joined the post office because you took the test, which wasn't, I don't know what it was, I never took it, but anyway, you got 10-point preference. So you were in. And so a lot of people in the military joined the post office. And one of the surprising things was that I just read about it in the Legion magazine was only about 55% of the GIs, servicemen in the war, took advantage of the GI Bill, which was a real surprise to me. I thought there'd be more than that.
Huh.
The only reason I joined the Legion was because the Legion was responsible. The Legion commander during the war suggested the GI Bill. He was holed up in a hotel someplace at a meeting, and he thought of this great thing that we had to do this for the veterans, and he proposed the GI Bill, and Congress passed it. And they said, oh, it's going to cost so much, you know, it's going to break the bank. And he said, in the long run, though, the government got all of its money back plus, because you got your degree, and you got a better paying job, and paid more taxes. So, nothing wrong with that.
So what, did you get an MA or an MS?
MA,
MA.
yeah,
And you have a PhD in journalism also?
in mass comm,
Mass communication?
yeah.
And then what'd you do after you got your doctorate?
Well, then, actually, in teaching at Sheboygan, there was a real demand for journalism, you know, 500 students, you couldn't find too many journalists there. And so I'd have a class of 3 or 4 people in it, and I thought, you know, they were talking about how expensive it is to run the campus. I thought, oh, I really felt uncomfortable doing that. And so then I started looking around for
A bigger
a
institution?
bigger institution,
Then where'd you end up?
in Vermont.
What's the name of the school? I'm testing you.
A place called St. Michael's College. In a way, I thought it was a waste for me anyway. I never really appreciated St. Michael's because I didn't think they appreciated something called the First Amendment. Although they said, you know, we're all for freedom of speech and press and so forth and so on. And I hated the president, Ed Henry. I had no use for him. And so I was, after about fourth year, I started looking around in earnest for something else and went to a place called Monticello.
No, Middle Tennessee.
And then the second year I was here, they made me the chair.
MTSU.
Yeah.
You didn't go back to Monticello, you went to MTSU. Middle Tennessee State University.
Yeah.
Did you like that?
Yeah, it was when I came, Sam Ingram, the president, had just come the year before, and he had a academic vice president. I can't think of his name, but anyway, he came from someplace in Georgia, and when he came, he said he's going to shake up the place. And so one of the first things he did was, if you'd been a chair for X number of years, he said, we're going to get rid of you, we're going to get new chairs. And so he looked at, not all of them, but he said, you're going to evaluate the current chairs. And so he looked at MassCom and said, I think we need a new chair there. And so he started giving it a hard time. And Ed said he knew he was in trouble one day. He went over to see him about something. And Ed has a knack for yakking. And he said, I went to his office and sat down and he said, I start yakking. And the vice president slammed his fist down on the desk and said, damn it, Kimbrell, what do you want? What are you doing over here? And he said, what's this meeting all about? And so, get down to business, whatever it was. And he said, I knew my days were numbered as chair. And sure enough, they were numbered as chair, and then I became chair.
How long were you chair?
12 years.
And when I know you were a dean in there somewhere of the College of MassCom. When did that happen?
I don't remember what year it was, but...
How many years were you dean? 3 or 4?
2 years. It was supposed to be for a year, and then they couldn't find anybody the first year, and so I stayed for the second year as well.
Did you go back to being chair, or did you go back to teaching?
I went back to teaching, and then the chair came open again. I became acting chair for a while, and the term all developed out of that. So anyway, Ingram left, and all my influence was gone, and so that was the end of that.
When you got out of the Army, did you join any veterans organizations?
No.
Do you belong to anything with the 37th?
I belonged to the 37th, but I never really joined until a few years ago. I belonged to the American Legion. The only reason I joined the Legion was because they were responsible for the GI Bill. So I felt, well, I owe them something. But I never go to any of the meetings anyway. They don't do anything here in town, so why go?
Did your military experience influence your way of looking at the Korean War or the Vietnam War or the Iraq War?
Well, I knew enough about the military that when the Vietnam War came, I was bound and determined that I would never let Robert and Stephen go into the war. And I think I told Stephen that if you want to go to Canada, I'll help you go to Canada. Or
I'll drive you.
I'll drive you. So. What's interesting about that, you know, you go to Washington, D.C. and you look at the Vietnam War Memorial, There's a Robert Nagy on there, there's a Stephen Nagy on there
Yep.
from Ohio. Both of them were from Ohio, if I remember.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to all of this?
Going to the Army was one of the most important things that happened in my lifetime. I think other one was the death of my father, the military, and getting a college education was another thing that I thought was very important.
Were you the first person in your family to graduate from college?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, none of my sisters went to college, so I was the only first one.
And every one of your children has gone through
Yeah, education is the key
all,
to success. Remember that.
all five of your kids either teach or work for a university.
Yeah, you don't have to, but you got to get a college education. And I remember Stephen, when we got to Essex Junction, I was talking to him one day. I said, well, he's getting ready to graduate from high school. I said, well, you'll probably be going to college to whatever. And he got real mad. He said, I'm not going to college.
What was he going to do? Join the Army?
I said, okay, you don't have to go to college if you don't want to. And then he went to the Army. Is that when?
No, he got his he got his degree first.
He got his degree. No, he didn't get his degree first. You had your degree when you went to the Army?
I took off a semester from school though.
Yeah. Well, you took some classes here at MTSU, didn't you?
Yeah, because
To get your degree.
my last, it was so expensive to go to St. Michael's, and you weren't teaching there anymore, so we had to pay. And so I could come down here. I needed 2 classes to graduate. So I came down here and lived with you guys at
Northfield.
the first apartment.
You took German, if I remember, didn't you? Didn't you take German, a class in German?
No.
You've been to Germany during your junior year abroad or something?
Yeah, but I didn't take German. I went to a German class with you guys.
Oh.
That you and Mom were taking German.
Roy Sheldon.
And I went in there and I was speaking with the guy, and everybody in the class was looking around going, what the hell are they talking about?
Roy Sheldon. Yeah. And you had to get a language credit too, and didn't you do, you had to sit down and talk German to him, and then he signed off
Oh yeah.
that you had, in effect, passed the writing, or the language requirement.
Right. Oh yes.
What made you decide you wanted to become an officer?
It sucked to be enlisted.
Did you ever want to be an enlisted person? Officer, how far did you get rank-wise in the Army? Were
I
you a
got to
colonel?
be a sergeant. I was what they call a T4, technical sergeant.
Did you ever want to go to officers training school?
No, no.
Well, the only reason I did it was I didn't know what I wanted to do. So
Kill time.
it was
Well,
something to do.
And you came
I always thought you'd make a great officer, Stephen.
He was one.
He was a great officer, yeah. And then he went to Fort Benning. Is that where you went? And then he met somebody called
Marion.
Marion, whatever,
Harrison.
Marion Harrison. And then he got married, and the preacher said to Marion, what'd she say, you will obey your husband or something like
Damn
that?
straight.
And Marion laughed.
Isn't that what the preacher said at the marriage ceremony?
Something like that, yeah.
She obviously wasn't paying attention during that part.
So how long have you been retired from MTSU?
4 or 5 years.
Do you miss it?
No. No. In fact, I probably should have left earlier. That's why they dumped me out at Izell. That was a message out maybe. And then that's when I really started hating the place. Then we got your old dean, what's his name? Lemming,
Lemming.
he was a pain in the butt,
Well, unbeknownst to us, he was sick.
yeah. So,
All right. Nick, you got any questions?
Nick, anything?
No,
Did you learn anything?
a lot. I want to look at this again.
Oh, you know, when it was in Manila, there was a kind of a lull. I forgot now where the pause came. But anyway, they said that we're going to be here a while and there's not very much going on. The university is operating. Anybody like to take courses? A course at the university while we're just marking time here. So I knew I was going to wanted to be a journalist, so I went to class, took typing in the Philippines. Got an A by first college.
How long did it take to learn Morse code?
About 3 weeks, I guess.
That's all?
Something like that.
And how many words could you click a
You
minute?
had to do so many words a minute, and I forgot now what it was. But
That's pretty
yeah.
fast, 3 weeks.
It's all Morse code. One of the guys who was in that class with me, he came out of service, he lived in Mason City, and he applied to be a railroad telegrapher with the Chicago Northwestern, and they did accept him. But he said the interesting thing about being a railroad telegrapher, it's exactly opposite of the Morse code. Where they have dashes, the railroad used dots. Where they have dots, the railroad uses dashes. And so it was a real challenge for him to shift gears from the regular Morse code to being a railroad telegrapher.
Well, as a radio operator, did you mostly do Morse code?
Yeah,
No voice communication?
we had some voice, but most of it was by shortwave.
So you must have gotten pretty good at it then.
Yeah, yeah,
Do you remember any of it?
yeah. SOS.
Is it true that you could tell by the way someone was clicking who was?
Yeah, you can. It's just like a signature. You can tell who's sending after a while by the way they manipulate the key. You can tell who's sending. So anyway, this guy in Mason City, after he worked for the railroad for I don't know how many years, he got fired because the railroad felt, we don't need telegraphers anymore. The passenger business was dead, and so it was all freight, all long distance freight. And so he and all the other telegraphers got canned, and they challenged it, went to court, and lost. And so he lost his job with the railroad.
Any other stories you want to tell us about the war?
No,
Nah.
no.
Okay. That was a lot.
Those three we want to put on tape.
Yes, we do.
Oh, you know.
You can say the swear words. We'll make Nick leave the room.
I don't do that.
I would agree.
It was a great experience, as I say. It wasn't that bad for me as being a radio operator. I mean, I had a Jeep or command car or whatever, and well, I guess the worst part of it was sleeping on the ground quite a bit. When we were up in the mountains, we had this so-called rule that the Japs operate at night, we operate in the daytime. But anyway, one night I was sitting in the command car, listening for a message or whatever, and I heard some noises from people, and I thought maybe it's Japanese, maybe some Japs found our CP there, and so I grabbed my rifle and got out of the command car and got off to the side, and took the safety off. And I'm waiting for these people to get closer. And I heard them talking, but I couldn't tell whether they were speaking English or whatever. But anyway, when they got up almost to where I was, I could tell they were Americans. And I'm just thankful that I didn't open fire on them, thinking that they were Japanese, because I'd have killed 2 Americans. And I'd probably been ruled justifiable homicide, but I didn't want that on my conscience anyway, so I didn't fire.
Did you ever fire your rifle?
At an enemy?
Mhm.
No.
You were always stuck with the radio?
Stuck with the radio, and during the mortars, we fired hundreds of rounds during the battle for Hill 700, as they called it. But that was the only time.
Do you have any desire to go back to the Philippines or
Yeah,
Bougainville?
wouldn't
or...
mind going back. One of the regrets that I had when we were in Manila, you know, had all this time on our hand, go to college if you wanted to. And the regret I had was that I didn't go to Bataan and Corregidor. And I could have done that if I'd wanted to. Because, you know, you just go down to the harbor, all these tugs and ships running back and forth, they could have gone over there. But they didn't do that, so.
Anything else you want to tell us about?
No.
Hi.
All right, Shane,
What?
wind her down.
I have nothing else
This
to
has
say.
been a Screen Gems presentation. All right, I'm clicking off.